6 p.m. on April 27th, thank you, 2023. So I'm going to hand it over to Ryan to get us started.
Well, welcome everyone to our first meeting. If we could start with introductions, we can start with Therese and just what your name is and what role you play as a committee member or as a school board member. That would be great. And that gives us a chance to practice with these as well.
Yeah, that's good. That is good. Okay. Okay, Ryan. So our name and role. Gotcha. Okay. I can do that one. I'm Therese Jones. I'm a Corvallis school board member, just finishing my 6th year with the school board.
Hello, I'm Aaron Rivers. I'm new on the budget committee.
Welcome.
Sami Adab-Drabo, Corvallis school board member.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Vince Adams. I'm a school board member, and I'm finishing my 10th year on the board.
Hi, I'm Courtney Holgate, and I am a new member to the School Board Budget Committee.
I'm Shauna Tomini, and excited to be continuing to serve as a school board member.
Hi everyone, Hui White Bear. I go by Lou, and I'm co-vice chair with Shauna on the school board, and I've been on the school board for 3 years now.
I'm Nikki Mendoza. I am a budget committee member. Did I mute it instead of turn it on? Is that better? Yeah. Okay. Nikki Mendoza, budget committee member, new one, newbie.
Sarah Finger McDonald, school board chair, and I'm finishing my 6th year on the board.
Ryan Noss, superintendent, and this will be the 7th time I've gone through the budget process with CSD.
Hi, Olivia Myers-Book, Director of Finance and Operations for the school district. I started in Corvallis the same year as Ryan, so we're both on our 7th Corvallis School District budget.
Hi everyone, Melissa Harder, Assistant Superintendent. This is my 4th Budget Committee meeting.
Bill Doherty. I believe this is my 4th committee meeting, and it's probably going to be my last because I got health issues that are starting to cause me to react to not paying as much attention as I should. But anyways, I appreciate the membership, and
Yep.
you saw that.
Yes, I did.
Oh, you're looking at me?
I am, of course.
I'm Jennifer Schroeder, and I've been serving as secretary of the Corvallis School District Budget Committee for 13 years, 14 years, somewhere in there, so got you all beat.
Well, thanks for being here, everyone. Tonight is really a not necessarily a budget committee meeting per se. We won't be sharing the budget tonight. This is really informational and giving everybody the opportunity to have some shared information and knowledge going into the process. And with so many new members, it feels like this is a good year to do it. We do this every year, but in particular this year with new committee members, it is again really meant to be less formal and more of a conversation and the opportunity to ask questions and to get oriented to the process before we get underway. At our next meeting is when I'll do the presentation of the budget to this group. But until then, this is really professional development and training on the process that we're about to undertake. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Olivia because she will be sharing information for the majority of the meeting tonight.
Okay, I'm going to do my best to do a lot of talking after being not well for over a week, but I am making a comeback, and I had a breakthrough today, so I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that I'm going to not start coughing. And I have some slides, and we're going to start really by going over the budget process real quick. Just to kind of give an overview, Oregon, so our budget process is really dictated by Oregon local budget law. So that's a state statute. So it's not just school districts, but all local governments in the state of Oregon are required to follow the same processes when it comes to their budget. And so this kind of outlines from the beginning to the end of the process. What I would say is this isn't necessarily like a short window of time. Our budget process is really nonstop, and it goes throughout the year. We do a lot of work and lead up putting a budget together and having the budget approved and adopted. But once the budget's adopted, we're still doing regular monitoring and regular work, adjusting the budget as needed, and doing a lot of reporting on the budget as well. So you can kind of see where we're at right now is in the process of preparing the proposed budget. So we're really early on in the technical process, and you can kind of see the next few steps. So in the next week or so, we'll be doing a formal publication of a notice of the budget meeting that's required by law. And then the committee is scheduled to meet twice on May 18th and then again on May 25th. When the budget committee is done with their work, the end result is the approval of a budget and tax levies. So once the budget committee is done with their work, then we have another required public notice where we have to publish a summary of the budget that was approved. And then in June, our school board kind of takes over the next step of the process. They hold a public hearing during a public school board meeting. And then the school board will eventually adopt the budget, make the appropriations, and make the tax levy rates. And then in July, we submit all of that information to Benton and Lynn County, and then they then start the process to implement those tax levies. So that's kind of just a snapshot of what that looks like. Same process for, like I said, all local governments, and there's not like a ton of specific date deadlines, but obviously the budget has to be adopted by June 30th, and we have to get those tax levies to the counties by July 15th. So the budget committee's main responsibility is to meet and review and discuss the proposed budget, make any changes to the proposed budget that they see fit, and approve the proposed budget in a series of public meetings. So we kind of just went through that process there, and that is essentially the primary role of the budget committee. You're going to hear the budget message from the superintendent at your first official meeting, which is May 18th. During the budget committee meetings, there is a period of time for public comment. So anyone from the community who wishes to testify before the budget committee may appear and make public comment. Another responsibility is to discuss and revise the budget as needed, approve the budget, and then approve the tax rate and levy amounts. Things that the budget committee doesn't really get into are details around what salaries we pay or benefits we provide and the contract terms with our collective bargaining units. The budget committee also doesn't set staffing levels or make organization structure decisions. The budget committee doesn't specifically decide if a program or service should be funded or make or alter district goals or policies. Policy and goal making is generally a function of the school board and not necessarily the budget committee. So I'm going to go real quick through an overview of the budget document. We do have a handful of new budget committee members, so I think it's important. So once you receive the proposed budget from us here soon, I don't want it to feel too overwhelming. It's kind of a big document, but I'm going to break it down as simplistically as I can. So there's really 4 sections to the budget document. There's an executive summary. So that's like if you just are only going to read one thing, read the executive summary. It includes the superintendent's budget message and an overview, highlights of the budget. The organizational section really has more details about the district, the functions of the district, kind of more of the narrative around how the budget was put together. The financial section is where all the numbers are. So it's the biggest section, and it's lots of numbers, and we'll talk about how that's organized. And then the informational section is really a lot of statistics, reference tables, and information that is utilized in how the budget was put together. So in the financial section, I want to go over a lot, like the terms we use for government accounting and the ways that we create a budget and the way that we report our financials. So we have multiple funds in the district, so each fund kind of acts as its own little operational entity. Our primary fund is our general fund, and then we also have grant funds, we have debt service funds, we have capital project funds right now because we're in the middle of a capital improvement program. So all of those funds represent kind of a different operation within the district. And then within all of the funds, what I will say is that in Oregon, all school districts in Oregon use the same chart of accounts. So we all account for our revenues and our spending the same way using a series of numbers. We call them functions and objects. So functions are how we classify like the programmatic function of the spending. So is it to do with instruction? Is it support of instruction? Is it more of a community service, facility acquisition and construction? And so those are how we classify the functions. And then the object is the thing that we're spending money on. So salaries, benefits, services, supplies, capital outlay, and then other objects. So when you hear fund, function, and object, that's really what that's about. And the way it kind of rolls out into the budget document is fund, function, objects. So for example, when you see Fund 100, that translates to general fund. Function 1291 translates to English language learners. And object 111 translates to licensed salaries. So in essence, this is saying we're using general fund dollars to spend money on a certified teacher that's teaching students in an English language learner program. So the budget document will have a section that includes all of the codes and all of the definitions of them, so that when you see something that you don't quite know what that is, you can go to that organizational section and you'll find all of the definitions for all the chart of accounts. So if you're new to the process, takes a minute to get used to. I know you can't, I don't expect you to see details or numbers on here, but again, when you're looking at the financial section of the budget document, you're gonna see it categorized by fund. So there's gonna be a whole section for general fund revenues and expenditures. And what you'll see is, again, by function and object. So that's how the budget is reported. And then there's multiple columns. And so the budget document will show the prior 3-year actuals, so actual revenues and expenditures. It will show the current year working budget, so the budget we're currently operating under. And then it will also show the proposed budget for next year. So when you get the document, you're gonna see lots of numbers, but in essence, you're gonna look at the fund, function, object, and then you're gonna look at 3-year history, current year budget, and next year proposed. So it gives you a lot of context around, you'll be able to kind of notice where things are changing or where things are moving to and from. Any questions about all that real technical stuff? Yeah.
So just if I remember correctly, if I want to see the total of objects spent across all funds, that's reflected in the executive summary or in the first, it's reflected somewhere where someone can see.
It'll be summarized in the executive summary, But in the at the beginning of the financials section, we include really high-level roll-up. And so before you get to the fund function details, we report totals by fund, totals by function, totals by object.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to move on. All right. So one of the purposes of tonight's meeting is just to give some background kind of on where we currently stand as a district. The school board gets regular reports from staff around our finances and our financial situation. They get a general fund financial report every month, and so a lot of information is shared with the board, but this is an opportunity for us to kind of talk about the things that are really driving factors in our budget preparation process and the information that we're working with as we try to develop the budget for next year. So I just want to start really high level with students, staff, and spending. So just starting with a look at student enrollment. So we know that our enrollment has been declining. Over the last 5 years, our enrollment's declined by 380 students, or just under 6%. That's a pretty steady decline and something we expect to continue. At the same time as our enrollment's been declining, our staffing levels have increased. Over the last 5 years, we've increased staffing by 110 full-time equivalent staff, which is almost 14%. Again, looking at high-level district resources, all resources combined, over the last 5 years, our resources have increased by 31.7%. And on the flip side, our spending has increased by 45.7%. So what you'll see here in these trends is kind of an inverse relationship that we have going on where our enrollment's declining, our revenues are not increasing at the rate that our spending is. And as a result, when you look at our spending based on student counts, you'll see that it's increased by over 54% in the last 5 years. This doesn't mean this is how much we spend on each student. It's just meant to show total spending divided by student enrollment. So when we start thinking about next year and the things that we're paying attention to, Vince always likes to laugh at my crystal ball. I feel like it never goes in the closet. It's kind of always out. Let's start with Ryan's favorite chart, our student enrollment by grade. This does a really good job of visually describing what we anticipate around student enrollment as we move forward. So you'll see that other than our 6th grade class, we have very small class cohorts right now. And so as students matriculate through our system grade by grade, we fully anticipate that our student enrollment will continue to decline, especially in the next 4 years, because those 4 grades 9 through 12 are all, a lot bigger than what we're seeing at K-8 right now. We do generally see an increase in students, so between kindergarten and 12th grade, that cohort does grow over time. But this is kind of really telling us what to expect. It also sort of translates to the notion of growth in the community. We know that there are more housing units that have been established in the last 10 years, but that doesn't translate to school-age children, particularly in our lower grades. Oh, yeah. We also, when we project enrollment for kindergarten, our biggest data point for that is birth rates in Oregon. We look at statewide birth rates, we look at Benton County births, we look at 2 different Corvallis zip code birth rates. And so that information doesn't necessarily look great, but based on birth rates, we don't anticipate that those kindergarten cohorts are going to look any larger than what they look like right now. Birth rates have, I think 2022 was the first year in 6 years where the birth rate did not decline in Oregon. And I know statewide there's been, there's been a recognition that that our population is changing and that our birth rates have generally declined in the state as a whole. So student enrollment is really the primary driver of how we are allocated state funding. So the state funding is really predicated based on average daily membership. And so that's really just, students that are enrolled in programs. And so obviously, like when your enrollment is increasing, you will receive more because you're getting $1 per student in that situation. And so when our enrollment is declining, we anticipate that our state school fund allocation will also be decreasing. What we're projecting for next year's enrollment is really only a slight decline of about 35 students, but it's the big factor in how we start our budget process when we start to project revenues for the following year. So this kind of gives a snapshot of, this is not Corvallis specific, this is statewide. So this is the Oregon State School Fund allocation and what it's looked like over the last 3 years and what our current projection is for the next biennium. So we're in the second year of a biennium, so 2021-23 biennium, we're in year 2. Our current biennial allocation is $9.3 billion. At this time, the allocation that's been proposed by the governor and also recommended by the Ways and Means Committee is $9.9 billion. And so it's also split between those 2 years, where 49% is allocated in the first year and 51% is allocated in the second year. But what you can see is, it does show that the state school fund allocation is growing, but I think the next slide is more telling because when we look at what that looks like per ADMW, it really is only a 1.1% increase from what we're getting per student right now to what we are expecting to receive per student next year. And you can see kind of how it's changed, right? It usually goes up by like, $400 or $500 per student. So this is problematic because, again, our costs are increasing at a rate that's much more than 1.1%. So when we look at the general fund and kind of what we're looking at right now for the current year, this really just compares our original projection, which was our adopted budget. So like this time last year, this is kind of what was put together. And you can kind of see what it looks like right now. It doesn't reflect a lot of change. So our projections aren't too far off from what we had originally anticipated. But we are projecting to spend about $1.6 million more this year than what we're receiving in our general fund. And this kind of illustrates that in a different way. So again, using current year or the current biennial allocation of $9.3 billion, this just represents what our projections are for the current year. We anticipate operating at a $1.6 million deficit. We have reserves to cover that deficit, and we anticipate ending the year with an ending fund balance or reserve level of $12 million, which is 13.7% of our operating revenues. So this next slide is really taking our current year projection and moving into the new biennium based on a state school fund allocation of $9.9 billion. When we look at our projected revenues based on enrollment and what we assume for enrollment, and when we anticipate the same types of increases in spending that we've historically seen, we know we're going to kind of run into a problem and that our spending is really outpacing our revenues at this point. And in order for us to end the next year with a balance of reserves that meet the board policy recommendation, which is 12.5%, we know that that means we would have to correct $4.8 million. So we either need to reduce our spending by $4.8 million or somehow increase revenue streams by some amount or a combination of both. And so really we don't have a lot of control over our revenue, obviously. It's really dictated at the state level and with what we're allowed to levy for taxes. And so at this point, we know that we'll have to reduce our spending in order to put together a budget that has us ending the year with a ending fund balance that meets the board policy in terms of the required level of reserves. So over the last couple of months, this is stuff we've been stewing on. The number moves a little bit every now and then based on updates that keep coming in. But that's really kind of, we started, I guess, in the fall, sharing this information with our leadership team, started kind of having those conversations about what this means long term, and then in the winter, got more specific and really got our projections firmed up, and then started talking about potential changes that we could make for the upcoming year. Are there questions before I kind of get into more specifics about what we're assuming for next year?
So thank you, Olivia. I do have two questions just to center us around the ADMW increase. You said the increase in the state school fund, if we see it, how it's going to impact the state and locally as well on ADMW, it's only an increase of 1 point fraction percent. So could you share with us any other percentages that we hear about from the state in terms of inflation, cost of living, bargainings that we hear, results of bargainings that we hear across the state,
Yeah.
Or any other costs that maybe could give us a more practical lens? What an increase per ADMW should be practical to continue the work we do?
Right, like when we look at over the last, the 5-year trend of our resources and our spending, right? Our resources have increased 30-some% over the last 5 years, and our spending has increased, 45% over the last 5 years. So it really puts the brakes on that trajectory. The trajectory was a little off to begin with. We were spending more than what we were bringing in, and that's really more about the declining enrollment. Essentially, we've been trying to hold ourselves harmless to some degree by not reducing spending even though our enrollment's declined. So we kind of are dealing with a combination of two negative factors where the state school fund allocation isn't increasing enough just to cover what we're considering standard increases in costs, but because of our declining enrollment, the increase is even less than what it would be otherwise, and so it's a kind of a double negative for us. What we do know is when in the early winter, January, we did a lot of work to across the state, school districts across the state, to determine what's the state school fund allocation that we would need just to kind of maintain status quo, and we determined that to be the $10.3 billion number. So in our district, that would reflect a positive increase in our resources. However, it doesn't eliminate the whole problem because we still have to reconcile to the fact that we're serving less students, which means less revenue. But it definitely would make things a lot better because we're just not even able to address the fact that everything is costing more. Everything costs more. Salaries and benefits are costing more. Services are costing more. Supply, everything is costing more. And we're not getting enough of an increase in funding to even address the fact that everything is costing that much more, let alone now we have to then do less. And that's really hard. Those are hard decisions to make, especially when we're still trying to support students that have really been disserved during the pandemic and just trying to recover still from that. And so that's what makes it extra hard.
So when we get that packet, we'll be able to tell like line items, what things are projected to cost us more next year than this year.
Yeah, I can't think of a single thing that's going to cost less next year. Even things like our utilities. When like as we're trying to reconcile the proposed budget right now and trying to find ways to reduce expenses, and you start looking, like all the different things you spend money on and how much they're increasing. And I see these big numbers, and I'm like, oh, what's that? And I was like, oh, that's our gas bill. We can't do anything about that. It's increasing, by like 20%, and it is what it is. Are we gonna stop heating buildings? No. Same with water and electricity, like all of those types of things. There's a lot of those components of our budget that feel, that you can't really make a lot of adjustments in those areas. Things like student transportation, we spend about $6 million a year on student transportation, and that's not an area where we can go to our provider and say, hey, can we renegotiate and pay you less? No, because we just know that we won't have any bus drivers if we go down that road. And so the negative ramifications for trying to save money are often not really doable. And so that's been a challenge.
Thank you.
The funding issue at the state is so problematic because like I said, we're not even getting enough of an increase just to deal with the fact that everything is costing more. And that's no different whether, it's your home budget or our budget. We all know that the cost of everything has increased quite a bit in the last couple of years.
Olivia, I have a question, and it was about the state funding.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any indication that will ever change, the per student allocation? Because it doesn't even out, like you're saying, like you get so much per student, but like all the bills cost more, and it's not like we don't want to pay people, because we actually want to pay people.
Yeah.
We would love to pay people more, right?
Yeah.
And we need to do benefits. That's important, and all of those just go up, but that allocation per student has stayed the same, right? Like largely. And have you ever heard of any changes on the horizon or not?
I haven't. I know there's not lately, but at least in the last 10 years, there's been a couple of times where a committee has convened to talk about the formula. That's really about the formula that's used in the state school fund allocation. It hasn't come up in the last few years. And it doesn't seem like there's a lot of interest to address that right now for whatever reason. There's definitely a lot of advocacy about increasing the allocation, and a lot of districts are, getting to that point where they're putting together their budgets, that information is coming out, people are responding and reacting in ways of almost kind of surprise. And so I think in the end, that's helpful for that to kind of come forward and come to light. We did a lot of work in the fall, and we're actually really pleased with the governor's recommended budget and the amount of funding that was included in that. And it took a lot of work to even get that 9.9 billion number. But at the same time, it felt like, okay, if we hit that target, it almost seems more challenging to get that number up again. And I think that's kind of where we're at. And there's so many competing interests at the state level. And I think that oftentimes the response in terms of funding is that we have other monies we can utilize outside of the state school fund. And the reality is yes, we do have some other funds, but they're not meant to like backfill the state school fund. They're meant to supplement the state school fund. And they're often restricted in how we can use them. And I think like that notion of, kind of putting, making it sound like we have other money that we can be using, it's not really addressing the issue. And especially a lot of the monies that we have are not long-term. The federal relief dollars that schools are still spending down is done after this year, 23-24, right? Everything has to be spent by June 30th of 2024. And so the hard part is if you're using that money for like ongoing costs, like we are in our district, that adds a third issue, right? Not enough money from the state to address the fact that things are costing more. Declining enrollment means less money from the state. Oh, and we're also using one-time money to kind of keep everything going, knowing that this time next year, then we're gonna have to reconcile that as well. And it's a kind of like a perfect storm of all bad things, but part of the work is to be transparent about that, to plan ahead, to have a long-term plan, and try to balance like what we're doing to not feel super impactful, but at the same time, try to be the best stewards we can, and try to, use that money, using that federal relief dollars in ways that actually benefit students versus trying to like find other ways to use it. I think has been important in our district in that we've really kind of taken risks in how we're using that money, but at the same time, we're doing it in ways that are directly impacting students, and we're not necessarily spending it on, facility improvements like a lot of districts have, and because we have other things going on around that, right? So it's been challenging, but again, those are kind of like the three factors. I kind of like, they're my three things. We're not getting enough money to cover costs. We're not going to get, any more money because of declining enrollment. And we're also, know that eventually we'll have to reconcile the fact that we're using one-time money to keep everything afloat.
Thanks for that, Olivia. Yeah, the formula sounds super problematic because it's been the same. Needs have changed so much over the years. So I appreciate you breaking that down for everyone.
One last really quick question. Do we know how funding will be allocated? I know that I think this biennium it's 50-50, and that's caused problems. Maybe are we looking at 49-51 in that? Is that required? I don't know where that is at.
It's currently 49-51, and it will be again. And so that's a good thing.
Yes.
And if it wasn't, we would do what we did before, where we hold back a portion of it, which happened in the 19-21 biennium is when that happened. Yeah. So I'm going to kind of get into some details around revenues and expenditures, the assumptions, kind of about what we're thinking about those as we build the budget for next year. And then just kind of wanted to end on going over the budget parameters that our board adopts each year, because once we get all this information, now we know all this information, and it's kind of like, okay, well, how are we going to approach this work, and how are we going to make these decisions, and sort of what are the things that we keep in the back of our minds as we go through that process. And so kind of wanted to start just by, again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but for our general fund resources, we know that students are expected to decline, so we know that has a negative impact on resources. We know that the state school fund isn't increasing at a rate that we'd like to see. That's also an issue. We have one positive about our general fund is that thanks to our community, our local option levy was renewed last year for another 5 years. So this provides a significant amount of support to our district in terms of what we can provide for students. We kind of have limitations on what we use that money for, and so those are kind of areas that would not necessarily look different as long as the levy is renewed. And so we're using that money to keep our class sizes lower, elementary art, music, and PE teachers, counselors. We use the money to support extracurricular athletics and activities. And so those are all positive benefits. Our elementary students that, have all of these art, music, and PE programming, our students don't pay any fees to participate in extracurricular activities. So again, some really positive things happening in our district thanks to the community support of the local option levy. So thank you, community. Oh, here's the other resources thing that we were talking about. So these are those other pots of money. Student investment account is a state grant. High school success is a state grant. And then ESSER 3, that's a federal COVID relief funding. And so these are kind of these other pots of money that we have that are outside of the general fund. And like I said, they are really designated for specific purposes. And even though we know that within the general fund, we're going to have to make reductions, that doesn't mean we get to take a bunch of stuff and like shift it to these grants. It just doesn't work that way. And so they all have specific purposes. The student investment account in our district primarily is what funds our mental health programming for students. So all of our mental health therapists and skills trainers in our district, we fund our elementary libraries with the SIA grant. A lot of very specific targeted investments within that. The high school success grant, again, pretty restricted in how it can be used. It's really meant to address dropout prevention, college level opportunities, career and technical education programs. You cannot supplant with that money. So that means that money has to be used for anything that's new, like can't be used to continue funding something that already exists. And so the things that we used those funds for are things we're just maintaining at this point. And then the federal relief funding, for us at this point, it's really just helping us offset that general fund deficit. We know it's not a long-term solution, but it's really a strategy to eliminate the impact that the proposed deficit is for next year. And so optimistically, if things start to look different in the general fund, then I think we would reconsider how much one-time money we're using to fund or to backfill that deficit. But for now, that's kind of a stopgap. And so that's kind of, when you hear legislators talk about how we have all of this other money, that doesn't mean that we get to take general fund spending and just shift it over there.
What is the dollar amount of ESSER dollar, or how many ESSER dollars are in the budget across all categories in this upcoming budget? About?
For next year's budget, we think we're going to have about $2.4 million left to spend next year.
And that's the end of it?
That is.
We have to spend it out, right?
Yes. And that's the third cycle of relief dollars that we received.
Thanks.
And that ESSER money that's left that we're using next year to help with or lack of funding from the state, was that already included in the budget you showed up here that showed the 5?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. So it makes a big difference, but it's not a good long-term solution. Okay. When we think about the spending requirements we have, again, I'll just repeat, nothing is costing less. We, kind of going back to what Lou said, we want to pay people what they deserve to earn to do the work that they do. We would never anticipate that salary and benefit costs would decrease, from one year to the next. Contracted services, again, that's really passing on the cost that the contractors we're working with, primarily around salaries and benefits, right, are passing down those costs. And just things, food costs have increased substantially, supplies have increased a lot, and so really what that means is we just have to find ways to spend less money on these types of things, knowing that the things themselves don't cost less. This is my summary. Yes, revenues are increasing, but expenses are increasing at a much higher rate, and we have to find a way to close that gap. Declining enrollment hurts the revenue. It prevents it from increasing more, and that's unfortunate. But again, The best thing about what we can do long-term is to know what's coming. And so that's why it's really important to pay attention to those enrollment graphs, to pay attention to more than just like what next year looks like. We're really looking at 2 or 3 years down the road. And again, knowing that we're doing some, planning to do some real short-term stopgap solutions, it's kind of like kicking the can, and we recognize that. And we've already been doing that essentially the last couple of years by spending more than what we're receiving, all to the benefit of our programs and our students, right? We don't want to, especially right now, we don't want to decrease programming for kids. And so we're kind of at that point now where we can't really keep kicking the can, and we're going to have to make hard decisions. I think I'm going to stop unless Ryan wants to add stuff.
Can I just add, add a comment? And I think what you're pointing out about the declining enrollment is really important, and with the reality that there's nothing anybody can do about that because more and more people are choosing to not have kids, and especially because of the reasons we've just been talking about, the cost of everything continues to go up. And so I wouldn't want the community to think we can just recruit families to Corvallis or recruit more kids somehow when that's just not the reality of the changing demographics.
Right.
And it's just a stark reality. That's why I was saying that formula is so outdated, because it doesn't keep up with even that trend.
To piggyback on that, I also know that affordable housing in Corvallis is really limited. And so I agree with you that that is a statewide and national trend. At the same time, there's a second governor on that, which is the ability to find affordable housing in Corvallis for young families. And so that also is why we have fewer kids coming in and more kids graduating out. The other thing that Olivia may have touched on that I may have missed when I was away for a minute is that as you go through this process this year it looks a little different than it will next year because the state adopts a budget for a biennium. Next year we'll know at this point in time how much money we're moving into the school year with. This year we will adopt a budget before the legislature goes home. And so there are times where, as a budget committee member, I've experienced people feeling some angst around that. And that's okay to feel that angst, but it is also predictable that it will happen. And so we're going to set a budget based on a number that we anticipate coming from the state, and we will adopt a budget based on that and just recognize the fact that they will still be deliberating on what that funding is going to look like for schools in the biennium, even after we've adopted this budget. So I just want you to know that going in, because there are times along the way where it feels like the order of events isn't quite right, and just know that that's always what happens in this odd numbered year.
We don't like it either.
I have a question on the enrollment piece. Are there concerns either with the Corvallis School Board or even with the state collection of school boards that these constraints on public schools will push parents to look at alternative forms of education, further decreasing enrollment? And what are we doing to combat that?
I haven't been a part of a statewide conversation around that. What we look at is we look at our enrollment trends, and one of the things that I've identified over the last couple weeks is that in terms of the number of kids in homeschooling, the numbers are back to what they were pre-pandemic, but we also know that during the pandemic, families moved in a lot of different directions. And so for some districts, that's part of more of the story. For us, more of the story is about affordable housing and birth rates. But it is, there's been conversations that have happened around bills that would change the percentage of students that could go to leave a school district and go to online. Right now, the cap is at 3% for a school district. We're not near that 3% mark, but there are conversations like that are happening around the state.
Okay. All right, so last slide before we wrap up tonight. I kind of have to repeat these to myself quite a bit in the middle of the work to center myself. And so I'm just going to say them out loud because that's literally what I do to myself when I'm in the midst of it all. So first and foremost, our goals for student outcomes should drive the budget process. Our desire is to provide every student with equitable access and opportunities. We want to make decisions that are informed by data. We want to base our resourcing decisions on the total value created for students. We need to be open to critically re-examining patterns of spending, take a long-term perspective, and be transparent. I think a lot of the work I've done over the last couple of weeks really brings me back to these about having to make hard decisions, but doing that in ways where we are protecting students in classrooms as much as possible, and critically re-examining patterns of spending, like when you really start to like deep dive and dig and try to find different ways of doing something. And I'm proud of our team for having done some really hard work over the last couple of months to get creative, to think outside the box, to be courageous and bringing forward new ideas. And none of that is easy to implement necessarily. But it does take courage to try. And I think we're at that point now where we have to try to look at things differently. And again, that notion of if it doesn't work, then we'll stop and we'll try something else. And just having a team around us that allows us to take that leap of faith, rather than just trying to do the same stuff over and over again and expecting different results, right? We're really trying to address some new and different needs that have popped up in the last couple of years, and that's required us to be creative.
So this may go to equitable access, which is on the slide, or this may be off limits for tonight's meeting, so tell me if it is. But I feel like we're ignoring the elephant in the room of all the media attention, social media, as well as just the local newspaper, as Bill brought in. I mean, is that going to be addressed in a forum here? Are we expecting like more turnout than usual for the next meeting because of all that's been going on? And maybe if you could share with us, what the kind of public response to that is, because I'm sure, especially people that know that we're on the budget committee, we're going to get questions about it.
Sure, yeah. We spend about 80% of our general fund budget on staffing, and so there's no way that we could put together a balanced budget that doesn't impact staffing levels, and we realize that. At the same time, we're also, again, going back to the use of those ESSER federal relief dollars, for staffing costs, that requires like a reconciliation at some point as well. We've added a lot of staff over the last couple of years. When students came back to in-person, it was like go time. We've hired a lot of staff, and it's almost like having to hit pause, reevaluate, and determine, okay, what's working? Let's make sure that we prioritize, keeping those things in place. And if there's new things that have, like new needs that have popped up, we know that we're working really hard to find, alternative pathways for middle school students, and that wasn't something we were talking about 2 years ago. That's a new need that's developed. Just because it's new doesn't mean it's something we're not going to fund. We're going to have to find a way to make that work. And so when we talk about equitable access and opportunities, we think of that from the student perspective, not necessarily from an adult perspective, but like from a student's perspective, what are things that we can do to keep their experience as intact as possible and to not have an impact on like their daily experience in school. And so those are the types of things we're thinking about when, if we when we need to make staff reductions, those are the types of things we're thinking about, right? We don't want to reduce staff that have a direct impact on students. We're having to make staffing reductions because of declining enrollment. When you have less students, you just don't need as many like elementary classroom teachers, and those are normal processes that we do every year. It's just been a little bit harder because, like I said, in the last couple of years, we've sort of kind of held everyone harmless. So even though enrollment was declining, we were maintaining those staffing levels, so their class sizes got a little bit smaller, and that was intentional because we knew that students were coming out of the pandemic and had some pretty significant needs. And again, best of intentions to try to, make that reentry for students as seamless as possible, but the end result is we do have to then kind of come back to that reconciliation of, okay, we're serving less kids, so there is some staffing level that needs to be adjusted to reflect that.
So I'd add a couple things. One is that we are still in recovery from a global pandemic, and it's starting to feel more and more like the only people that continue to recognize that are folks in education. As an example, last summer we were provided with $1.4 million for summer school, again thinking about kids coming out of a global pandemic. This year the state has provided $0. And so when those kinds of things happen, I become frustrated in the fact that kids sacrificed so much for the adults through a global pandemic, and we're still asking kids to make sacrifices at this stage of the game. The community rallied at Benton County Courthouse today in support of public education. We know 9.9 doesn't get us where we need to be. 10.3 and some money for summer school would be great. When I know summer school's not on the table any longer, but for some reason that message isn't getting the clarity it needs because we still have work to do. We have kids who went home in March of 2020 as third graders and returned to us as sixth graders. We have kids who have lagging skills because of that period of time, both academically and socially and emotionally. And so there is still work to be done, and it's frustrating to be in this space. We will have public testimony from folks who are advocating. Today the advocacy was around the decisions that are being made at the state. At times that advocacy will be focused on decisions that administration is making. I anticipate that, and I also recognize that we have some limitations that we have to live within. So yeah, that is my personal perspective. I don't know who decided the pandemic was over and that we were back to where we were prior, but it feels like somebody's made that decision and has left us out of that conversation.
Well, and they, not only have they decided the pandemic is over, but they are failing to recognize that school districts are dealing with the same inflation as everybody else. So they're funding us as if we recovered from the pandemic and inflation's what it was before the pandemic. I mean, it's really not recognizing the reality of what's happening in education right now.
So one of the things that came to me too that I think was related was as I was looking and being reminded of the budget parameters again, I started thinking about some of the things that we have been asked around just community voice and input on the budget, and in terms of educator thoughts and creativity and other staff being able to give input on how these decisions are being made, especially when we're facing cuts or potential cuts. And so as I was looking at those budget parameters, the space where that actually stood out to me as a place for us to be really expansive in our mindset, and I just wanted to check my thinking with you too, was around decisions informed by data. And often we think about data as being specific quantitative statistics in a certain way. And are we also looking at that in terms of being teacher voice, educator voice, staff voice, student experience, and student voice as an expansive way of including data? Or can you address how that might fit into the budget parameters?
The feedback that we've received in the last couple of months about middle school. I wouldn't say we have a lot of like statistics and hard data to show, how, students are dealing with social and emotional changes. So again, that's kind of that example, right? We're hearing that feedback. We hear it from staff, we hear it from parents, and we're working to address that. And it means, finding a way to spend money to address that, which means finding somewhere else where, we can maybe go without, because that issue is more important to address.
Just following along on thank you for raising the topic of behavior, because it is boiling over right now. But I wanted to just add that this is a topic that the district's been working on for a while. Our goal is that every child graduates with a plan for post-secondary life. And that means that we have to mitigate some circumstances, some things that kids bring to us, because we don't get to pick and choose kids. We take all kids. And so this district has been, making, allocations in programming to address those needs. And then we had a pandemic. So this is layered, and I'm thankful that we made those choices pre-pandemic to have mental health clinics, to add behavior coaches, because that helped us in the pandemic. It's helping us now. But we can see that it's still not enough. So I just wanted to add that this is something that we've been talking about, and this district is probably one of the best prepared in the state. Our problems, while they are hard, there are places where it is harder. So thank you.
I want to just really thank you for the presentation, taking our questions, and I want to just recognize how really difficult the situation we're headed toward is. I used to be, and I would like to say I'm always excited about the budget, but now I'm anxious. I feel sad, but also still realistically optimistic that we gotta do this work, and we prepared for this. And that's where I would like to ask, and I know you're nearing the conclusion of submitting a budget, is if we have made strategic investments in the past, we aligned them with our school board goals, and also we always reflected on the parameters, as you mentioned. We should continue to do that, even if those strategic investments are declining, or maybe this year are not existent. But we got to communicate where are our priorities, not only through the goals, but also through where we're spending, even if it is less in terms of amount of dollars. And to the point Ryan mentioned, there are so many things outside our control for what we're handed. So I'm very optimistic and trusting as well that you will be making the best decisions to propose a budget for what we were handed within the committee, but outside the committee, each individual of us in their personal time, we ought to speak to the legislator and tell them this is wrong. This is wrong because public education is not a sprint, it's a marathon of 13 years for each child, and defunding education or increasing it by 1 point percentage this coming biennium means a huge impact. And I'm just reflecting on the saying that Governor Vicatillo, when he was asked to cut, and he said we cut the flesh until we cut the fat until we were left with the flesh, and now we're handed just the bones. And I feel over the next 13 years, we're handing the kids just the bones of our schools. We're not giving them the best things that they deserve in terms of behavioral supports, reading supports, and being able to graduate. So really appreciate your work doing what we can with what we're handed, but 9.9 is not going to be enough on the long term. It's really a warning sign for us that more difficult decisions will happen down the line if we don't do a corrective action on the state level. So I don't know how to end with a positive message here. There's no positive thing other than we got the best people here to do this work. You and I ask for your patience for our critical questions, or at least my critical questions that will be coming in the upcoming meetings, so we can make sure we're doing the best thing with what we're given, recognizing it is a really difficult situation with those assumptions. This is really a tragedy, and hearing from Portland needing to cut an equivalent of 90 FTEs for a size of Portland, and for us 40 to 50, and for a Park Rose, which is school districts almost half of our size, around 11, it's going to be harder as the school district is smaller in size. And the community needs to be aware that this is a statewide challenge, and also even more difficult as the district is smaller. So just recognition of your really hard work on this, and also seeking your patience for the tough questions we might be coming up with in the next few weeks. Thank you.
I really appreciate you saying that, Sammy, because that's why I was asking some of the questions or making some of those points too, is because this is not just here, it's like a very systematic issue in how the funding is allocated through the state, and it's not something we can just fix easily or just have a magic wand that I wish I had for the schools, because they're so important, and we have to do some strategy thinking as a community, not just like as a board or just as the community and the board, because we are part of the community, but I think there just needs to be a lot of thinking on that larger scale, like that statewide, national scale, about how public education is viewed and valued, and what is valued over public education too. So thanks for pointing that out.
I'll just add one more positive note to echo what Sammy said and what Lou said, is I really appreciated what Sammy said about trusting the people that we have here. I am so thankful that we have you all doing this work, because I think, as you all know, we moved back because of the Corvallis School District. We believe in it. We trust you all. I'm glad to be engaged in it, to learn more about it, and to do what we can to help with that process. But thank you for doing that. And I appreciate the hard position you're put in, and I appreciate that you're going to get us through this.
I would just say that I think the work over the last month has probably been some of the most challenging of my career, not the technical work, but because of our values in this district and how we want to approach the work, to achieve a balanced budget really requires stretching and like mind bending and like really digging deep to find ways to make things work that, again, don't impact the student experience. And I do feel that when the superintendent presents the proposed budget to you, I think you'll feel good about that perspective of it, because I do feel like the types of decisions we're making are really with keeping like the student experience perspective to heart, and making sure that all the great things that kids get to experience in Corvallis schools doesn't look different next year because of this. A lot of those things we talked about, things that maybe you don't see in other districts, those aren't things that we're just gonna go in and start changing and taking away. So everyone on my team can attest to, you know, the types of conversations we're having to have, and making sure that they're all made with intention and deliberation and collaboration too. We're not, you know, making these decisions in a vacuum, and really trying to involve the experts as much as possible. Staff.
Thank you, Olivia. I was recently looking back through my calendars since I joined the board. I think 2017, I was attending rallies asking for additional funding for schools. 2019, I was attending rallies asking for additional funding for schools. 2021 was a little bit of a different story because we were in the middle of a pandemic, but here we are back in 2023, having rallies, asking for additional funding for public schools, and our state legislature has failed us over and over and over again, and they're not really failing us, they're failing our children, and it is a lot cheaper to educate our children properly so that they can go out and be successful adults than it is to cut their education and limit their opportunities in school so that their opportunities when they leave school are limited. And it's just, looking at that calendar was so frustrating because I feel like we've heard this story before and the legislature doesn't hear it. So anybody who's watching this meeting, go talk to your legislators because that's where the message needs to be delivered. So we will meet again on May 18th, and at that meeting we will nominate and elect a committee chair and a vice chair. We will receive a budget message from the superintendent. There will be public testimony, some of which will probably be hard to hear this year. So for new budget committee members, be prepared for that. And we will deliberate and ask questions. We have 2 budget committee meetings scheduled. So at that meeting, we will have the opportunity to deliberate and ask questions. If we are done, we could approve the budget and tax rate and tax amount, but the committee can also choose to meet that second time. I unfortunately am not likely to be, at least at the May 18th meeting, but I will definitely be here in spirit because this is important work, especially when it's hard work. So is there anything else that anyone wants to add this evening?
I just want to add one thing, and Jen referenced it real briefly in an email that you got a couple days ago, but we always try to get a budget document to you in advance of the meeting. I'd say this may be the year where that doesn't happen, but we will try to get it to you the week of the meeting. And just, again, stay tuned. When the agenda for the meeting has to get posted 5 days in advance. So when the agenda gets posted, we'll provide you an update because we'll be far enough along at that point to be able to let you know. And we will make you a hard copy if you would like one, but we always, post it on Board Book and on the website as well. So we will let you know as soon as it's ready. And if you want a hard copy, Jen will definitely put one together for you. But we'll just keep you posted along the way. We've got 2 weeks to go.
Thank you, Olivia. Anyone else? And with that, our meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.